On today's Locked On Bucks, believe it or not, another coaching addition made to Doc Rivers' staff. We'll give you the latest name there. His tie to the Bucks, which is an interesting one. And off the heels of some of the conversations we've had last week about Doc Rivers and his appearance on the Bill Simmons podcast, an interesting conversation that took place on the latest Bill Simmons podcast with Ryan Russillo as it pertains to legacies and specifically one member of the Bucks. We'll open up that conversation as well coming up next on Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome into Locked On Bucks. I am Justin Garcia, joined by Camille Davis. We thank you for making Locked On Bucks your first listen every day, free and available wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us on YouTube as well, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Bucks is brought to you by Prize Picks. It's the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Head over to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA and use the code, all lowercase, LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Camille, we mentioned more changes coming to this Bucks assistant staff for Doc Rivers, less than a week removed from Doc's appearance on the Bill Simmons podcast, where, again, one of the things that we spent some time talking about as we dissected some of Doc's comments were that small portion where he just talked about his staff and the importance that he seemingly stressed of needing to have your own guys, that it seems like they found a few holdovers that fit within Doc and this group, but trying to make sure that group is fully Doc Rivers' group. And look, the big piece, the addition of Darvin Ham that we mentioned, more changes coming as well through this process. One big name that's still out there we're going to get to in a second here, but the latest addition for the Bucks is Jason Love, who had spent the last handful of seasons in Philadelphia with the Sixers as a player development coach under Nick Nurse, obviously under Doc Rivers as well. And now he is joining the staff. No word on if it's the same role or what, but he is going to be joining that staff for the Bucks next season.
I mentioned this when the news of the hire of Greg Buckner came out, but this coaching staff is getting quite large again, almost approaching the size of the bench that Doc initially inherited, which he remarked that, it's nuts to have, 11 coaches on your bench. And if my count is correct, we're up to 10 now at this point, with all of the hires that we've heard about, plus who we have heard has been retained on staff who we haven't heard anything new about. So now we're looking at Darvin Ham, Greg Buckner, Pete Dominguez, Dave Yeager, Rex Kalamian, Ben Baker, Trevor Gleason, Patrick Mutombo, Joe Prunty, and now Jason Love, who, as you mentioned, was known for being a player development assistant in the past. So I'll be curious to see what his role will be here on the Bucks as well. It's something I mentioned when we were talking about Sam Cassell possibly coming over to the Milwaukee Bucks from the Boston Celtics, that's some brain drain from another Eastern Conference rival. So that's good news for the Bucks in of itself. So I hope that when Jason Love gets here, we've talked about the young guys on the roster, how there is going to need to be some development from them as well. So hearing that Jason Love has a background in that does give me some optimism about what he might be able to do with some of the young guys on the roster. And then again, just like I said, the brain drain is always nice coming from a rival.
A couple of quick things on Jason Love. The last point, I agree. I also think let's be cautious about it, because I think one of the big pieces that we all sold ourselves on with Adrian Griffin too was that development piece. And not to say it's not true, but we all kind of clung to, well, Jimmy Butler said he was very instrumental in his development and wanted him to be the head coach. Some guys, I think, as it relates to Jimmy Butler, you see a lot of the same similarities with Giannis, where he is just driven. He's going to get there. It doesn't matter of who it was that was working with him as a developmental coach. The one caveat or change I would point out here And again, you made the point. We've talked about this a lot too. You just don't know a lot of times with assistant coaches, good or bad, who was responsible for what. We'll know who was responsible for scouts and scouting the opponent of that particular matchup that evening. But in terms of, hey, this guy's working on this stuff with players, or this is this guy's personal guy, you'll start to see some of that develop, but you don't know the full picture unless you're there at practice seeing what happens. So that's the big difference between this and football, where this guy's coaching the cornerbacks and et cetera. But I think one of the other things that is, just as I said, let's be careful with it. One thing that goes in the other way is, there was a lot of young players, a lot, maybe much. There were multiple young players with Philadelphia last year, the year before as well, that we started to see take some development. I mean, obviously Tyrese Maxey is what you would point to and say, well, I would assume he played a pretty big role there and helped work with Tyrese Maxey. Paul Reed is another one of those guys. They've had a number of fringe level rotational pieces as well that you've seen flashes from, I think pretty similar to what we've talked about with guys like Amarjan and Andre Jackson Jr. But to your point of, hey, you got a handful of these guys. This is what this guy primarily focused on the last handful of years here. That in itself should be very beneficial versus, and not to say that none of those coaches are capable of doing this, but versus just, hey, we got a pretty experienced, good staff. That's who we're going to learn from. You do have that, but now you also have somebody that's specialized in that.
Yeah, and that's something that's always useful to have on your roster. Now, to your point, like we mentioned before, we don't know exactly what everyone is going to do, but when you're looking at the staff that's being put together, we've talked about the veteran the veteran guys on this bench. It's like the Avengers of assistant coaches on the Bucks bench at this point. But listen, I'm just curious to see how this continues to shake out. If all of these names that I mentioned earlier are going to be on the roster for the Bucks, so to speak, come training camp, if there are other moves to be made. Because one other thing that has been floating out there is the fact that the Bucks' pursuit of Sam Cassell, just because the Bucks got Darvin Ham, does not mean that pursuit is over, which was surprising to me. I still don't know how likely it is, but we have heard that Sam Cassell is one of Doc Rivers' best friends. So there could be something to that. I would just be really curious about the role he would play, so on and so forth. But I'm just curious if there's any more movement on this bench, because we got Greg Buckner. It's like, maybe this is, we might have some more movement going on. But I was thinking initially, if we hear any more movement, it's going to be, okay, someone's departing this coaching staff at this moment. But instead, another addition onto this Bucks coaching staff. So curious to see how that shakes out. And before we started recording, Justin, you mentioned a very interesting Jason Love Milwaukee connection about his time when he was in Philly. And I need you to let the people know what that connection is to this team, because it's quite interesting.
I suppose we should preface too with, look, don't hold it against him. But Jason Love was the assistant coach that was on the floor that night in Philadelphia during Laddergate, who had told Giannis, you cannot shoot free throws here. And then the whole dust up that we saw with Trez, Jason Love was that assistant that was out there. So that is his only current connection to the Milwaukee Bucks.
Yeah. Well, hopefully, hey, it's in the past, maybe with some ladder jokes or something like that when he gets here to Milwaukee. But I'm assuming they'll put that all in the past and try to get to work.
I mean, the assistant's ladder in Milwaukee, if no one, in terms of publications, if the Journal Sentinel or Eric Name at the Athletic, anybody, Brew Hoop, if nobody uses that, you've done a disservice to everyone.
Hey, listen, free game on Locked On Bucks, giving it out. Just giving it out. Someone has to take advantage of that one.
Before we do move on to that legacy conversation, you mentioned Sam Cassell, Marc Stein. The headline was a bit deceiving in his most recent post, because I think it was just recycled from a week or two ago, basically the same headline. And within the most recent, I guess, blog post, you would call it, from Substack that Marc Stein did over the weekend, maybe it was Friday, he seemed to indicate he doesn't think the chances of it are high, but as you mentioned, said door's not closed. I know that the Bucks, they would still love to have Sam Cassell. I think the addition of Darvin Ham and just how big the staff is getting is one part that's going to make it difficult. The other one being is I've said a couple of times, I still think Sam Cassell is going to the Lakers as JJ Redick's lead assistant with that connection he has, represented by Clutch. And just you would assume you want a very experienced assistant to be paired up with JJ, assuming it is JJ Redick that gets that job. So that's what I would assume happens. But it was interesting nonetheless to see, okay, this, even though it didn't sound encouraging from Marc Stein, that it wasn't just, hey, the Bucks are set, they're done.
Yeah, exactly. Because that's what I assumed to see. Like, of course, like Darvin Ham's the lead assistant, this door is closed completely. But no, it's still a possibility. So until we officially know, we just have to keep our ears open and just continue monitoring the situation with Sam Cassell. Because you mentioned the Lakers. I think he might end up just staying in Boston and taking that lead assistant job there, since Charles Lee is heading over to be the head coach of the Charlotte Hornets. So we'll see. Boston, LA, Milwaukee, either coast or the Midwest. We'll see where he ends up.
Speaking of where people end up, we've seen more names added to the list of players that the Bucks have worked out for the upcoming draft. And we'll mention this here as well. We are going to spend a bulk of this week and in all likelihood, all 3 of next week's shows as well, leading into the first 3, I should say, shows next week, leading into the draft, focused on those players that would most likely fall where the Bucks are drafting, or early in the second round, late first round, early second round. Do more of an in-depth look at those guys who would fit with the Bucks, who they're projected to get via the mock drafts, and a little less the conversation, but some of it on whether or not they keep the pick. So for the majority of this week and next week, it is going to be very NBA draft heavy. We will get into some of those names later on in the show. But when we do return, that conversation that I mentioned, that Bill Simmons and Ryan Russillo started to have about Damian Lillard, and some interesting things they had about the Milwaukee Bucks as well. The legacy of some of these players, who has the most at stake, and the Bucks as a team. We can get into that conversation coming up next year on Locked On Bucks. Well, when you are hiring as a small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help you find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. They aren't just another job board. They have a vast network of more than 1 billion professionals, making it the best place to hire and giving you access to professionals you cannot find anywhere else. LinkedIn does all of that while making the process easy and intuitive. Hiring is easy when you have that many quality candidates. So easy that, in fact, 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. LinkedIn knows small businesses are wearing so many hats and might not have the time or resources to sift through those candidates and make the hire. So they're constantly finding ways to make the process easier, and even just launched a feature that helps you write job descriptions, making that process easier and quicker. 2.5 million small businesses use LinkedIn for hiring, and you should do the same. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnba. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnba to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. All right, Camille, we've not to just be the because there is already a podcast out there. We're not crowding in on their corner here, but not to be the podcast that just recaps what Bill Simmons has to say. But it's been interesting, an interesting couple of weeks here with Bucks related content. And that continued on his Sunday night pods. Part 1, the first half of that show focused on legacy. So the impetus for this was, it seems like Kyrie Irving has turned his legacy around, that it went from he was one of the all-time greats to everybody gave up on him to now it's back to, hey, Kyrie isn't so bad after all. So they were examining who out there has the best chance, most likely, to kind of capture some of that magic and do the same next season. A couple of interesting names that were thrown out there. I think the 2 most interesting ones, and I suppose we'll get into this, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts. It depends on, look, how do we view this specific player's legacy? How important is that? Yada, yada, yada. But to me, the 2 most interesting ones that they mentioned, Paul George, who is a name that we've heard linked to the 76ers quite a bit, We even saw on NBA Countdown, Joel Embiid sitting next to Paul George, even gave him that side eye when he said,
Mhm.
well, we got to get better. We got to find players that will help us get better. So that's interesting. And in terms of basketball, it's seemingly a perfect fit. Paul George, kind of similar, not quite as much as Kyrie, but a guy that came out, man, this is going to be one of the young stars of this league. And then it just became a joke and memes of playoff P and Paul George hitting the side of the backboard and coming up short. So in that regard, hey, goes to Philly. They go on a deep playoff run. Maybe they reach the finals. All of a sudden, hey, Paul George wasn't so bad after all, is the context of shaping the legacy. The other interesting name that they both landed on pretty early in the conversation was Damian Lillard. So when I mention that, your immediate thoughts are what, Camille?
That it's interesting to say it's like a career, like legacy defining season for Dame, because the first question that I would have with that is like, okay, well, how do you look at Dame's legacy now? Is he just a championship away from cementing something? He's already considered a top 75 player in NBA history. So is this more so just like icing on the cake for him? Or do you feel that last season was so bad for Dame that this upcoming season is going to be something that can either like take the stink off of what people saw last year or what? So that's like my mind goes first of like, okay, how do Bill and you said who else was on the show with him? Ryan
Russillo. Yeah.
Ryan Russillo, like how do they feel about his legacy as it currently stands? Because like I mentioned, he's already seen as one of the greatest NBA players to do it. Outside of Steph Curry, he's one of the guys you look to first as somebody who can really, really stretch out defenses with this ability to knock down some really, really deep 3-pointers. He comes across half court and that's in his range. So for me, I'm like, okay, well, Dame's already a good player. And I'm one of the people who's not in the majority of thinking that you need a ring to like solidify something. Like I think you can be a great player and not have a ring, a la Charles Barkley, which I guess shows my age sometimes because I think about him playing and I'm always like, man, Chuck was cold. But I know some younger people were like, oh, he don't have no ring, so it is what it is. And it's like, no, like you did not see him play. Like he's like 6'5", power forward. It was amazing to watch. So for Dame, I don't necessarily think like it changes his legacy wholeheartedly in my eyes, but I understand how important rings are to a lot of different conversations. So I know that's what he came to the Bucks for. There's always going to be the Miami Heat ties and connections with that about, oh, if you would have won here, things could have been different, but now you win in Milwaukee. Are you happy? So on and so forth. So I don't know if I would say for myself, I think it's a legacy defining season, but I will say it's a prove it season for Dame for sure. Because I don't think that this season in Milwaukee went the way that anybody necessarily thought it would. We've had the conversations about him being in him being in shape, him getting used to the offense, how often he has the ball in his hand, so on and so forth. So for me, it's one of those years where it's like, let's see if you can really be that second superstar to Giannis's, like does this pairing work more than anything than it being just an indication on his legacy as a whole?
So a couple of things with that. Part of their conversation was, and again, it all ties back to the Kyrie Irving takes that we've seen since the second round of the playoffs, really towards the end of the regular season when Dallas started to look much better. And you saw a lot of people saying, hey, Kyrie and Luka, if they're playing like this and they found their defense, this could be a dark horse team. It was in the sense of, in terms of the legacy, how it rebounds from here. And their point was, Kyrie this season kind of accepted this is Luka's team. I'm just going to be the ultimate supplemental scorer and help make this team better. This is Luka's. I'm going to be the best number 2 that there is in the league. Whether or not he is an entirely different conversation, but they kind of flipped that on the Bucks too. Of part of this legacy defining season for Damian Lillard is we're entering next season with the assumption, and this was their words, Giannis is going to be a man on a mission. He's had 2 straight seasons derailed by injuries, last season especially, but you can't ignore the game or time games missed in that series against the Heat 2 years ago. They've heard all the chatter about, losing in the first round 2 years in a row, doing one of that as a 1 seed, yada, 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 the Doc Rivers experiment, Giannis handpicked a coach, all of the conversation that's going on. They're aware of it. So I do think it's going to be a Bucks team that is entering the season as if they feel like we have something to prove. The dangerous part of that conversation, though, Camille, is we had the same conversation last year and Giannis had the Instagram posts too of I hear all the words, I hear all the chirping, I'm coming. And you got the same result. Now, injuries were a huge part of it. It wasn't just injuries, but I think that's one thing you got to be cognizant of and know, like, well, people are going to be quick to point to that. So that was how they kind of framed it of like, we're assuming this. Maybe Dame just says, okay, this Giannis's team, I'm going to be that number 2 supplemental guy, and I'm going to be the best in the league at it. I just don't know if that's going to be the case because and I don't mean that in a bad way of like, well, Dame needs to find his place and kowtow to Giannis, because what we heard from Doc Rivers from day one, even before he took that Bucks job, was Dame's almost playing tentative and trying to fit in when Doc made the point of, no, you don't fit in when you're an all 75 player. They fit in around you. So I think in that regard, it's a much different conversation of what does Kyrie Irving absorb versus what Luka takes on in Dallas. But I think here, it's not a my turn, your turn thing, but next season, ideally, it is much more of a 50-50 partnership than just Giannis is the one-man wrecking crew. And then if you focus in on him too much, here's Dame that's going to knock down shots.
Yeah, in that sense, and as well as just thinking about it of like, we want to see Dame and Giannis on the court together with like a synergy where it's like their games are actually making the other's game easier for them. Like they're presenting some type of challenge for a defense where it's like, how do we solve this puzzle of what these two can bring to the table, especially when you start looking at who those surrounding pieces are. Like we always talk about the 3-man game when you bring in Chris Middleton as well into that mixture. But yeah, I think that's more in line with where I would be at, where it's like, I'm just more curious to see like the fit of Dame and Giannis, because think about it, like before last year, his last year in Portland was one of the best seasons that Dame has ever had. Then he comes to Milwaukee. It's a really big adjustment for him. So I'm curious to see what does that look like going for him next season? Because, I mean, listen, we're all getting older. I just had a birthday like a few weeks ago. I understand it. And with Dame seeing him last year, like, yes, he's losing some of that explosiveness that we've seen when he was a little bit younger, but like, how does his game continue to evolve? In what ways can he find ways to be effective? So that's what I'm looking forward to most. I wouldn't say, if I had to answer the question that Bill put forth, I wouldn't say Dame has like the biggest incoming legacy season. Honestly, Paul George is a good one. But that guy he was sitting next to on NBA Countdown is another one, Joel Embiid, where it's like, these are Philly teams that have not made it out of the second round of the playoffs throughout this entire tenure. This is trusting the process for years now. So like for me, it's Joel Embiid. Can you stay healthy through the season? Can you finally get Philly into the Eastern Conference Finals for one? To me, that's a bigger legacy question than what Dame has had, because for me, it just seems like more of a fit question around him and Giannis. How can they make their games play off of each other better? And can he add that ring to his resume? But Dame's already been stamped as one of the greatest players to do this. So my answer would be Joel Embiid, just to throw that one out there.
Well, and I think the interesting part of the conversation, the parts of it that I heard, were it was almost framed as if, if the Bucks as a team have the same type of season that they did a year ago, if Dame has the same type of season individually, where I don't think when we gave out our grades, we gave Dame around a B- somewhere like that. Of like, was it what you expected? No. Was it, as bad as you would hear pushback on? No, it could have been better. And I think everything we've gone over ad nauseum off the court is the reasons why he had those bright moments. It just wasn't that consistent. So I think if he has another one of those seasons, though, they had kind of drifted towards does this guy just kind of become like Carmelo, that we have that same type of conversation that, he can score, but that's about it. And do you start to bounce around from team to team? And is that the legacy that becomes for Damian Lillard? The legacy component to it, I mean, it's always, I don't know what to do with it in terms of those conversations, because how you view it is different from how I view it. If Dame would have stayed in Portland every single year of his career and not won But, similar to what we hope is the case with Giannis, although he did get that championship, but you stay with that one franchise, you put up the big numbers, you're the guy that wants to resurrect that franchise and make it relevant, but it just never happens. Well, if you have the same numbers that you would have had split between a couple of teams, your legacy is always viewed much better in that sense too, of, well, he's the guy that didn't run from the fight, even though sometimes it's inevitable and we all have to just, you know what, let's regroup for tomorrow. So that was the interesting part to me, is just already hearing it sink to that of, well, if it doesn't happen this year, then is he all of a sudden Carmelo? And is that the conversation that we have? And not to put you on the spot here, Camille, but I think, again, how interesting it is to have these legacy conversations. If both of their careers ended today, who would you say had the better legacy career as it be? Damian Lillard or James Harden?
At this point, I think I would say Dame, just because we've seen James at this point jump to a few different teams. So that's the thing too with Dame. If Dame ends up being just a 2-team, guy where he started in Portland and he finishes in Milwaukee, he signs a new contract, finishes his career in Milwaukee, that looks different than somebody who has gone from OKC to Houston to Brooklyn to Philly to the Clippers. And with Harden in particular, I think why I give Dame the edge over him is just how he was exiting some of those teams as well. It's not like he left franchises in a better spot. He had some antics on his way out the door. But of course, when he was on, like, thinking of Houston Rocket James Harden, like, that was a different type of ball game for him, but also the playoff performances for James Harden, they just haven't been up there, where Dame at least has some game winners in his, in his resume there, and has gotten to the Western Conference Finals as well as being like the guy on his team. So I think I would go with Dame over Harden in that one, but that could be just the last few years of how things have shaken out with James Harden tilting me that way, and also the fact that Dame's story hasn't all the way played out yet.
Yeah, Harden's played 3 additional seasons than Dame has, and about 200 additional games than Dame had. I think the point you made about the postseason is the big one. I mean, James Harden's played in 166 playoff games. Dame's played in 65 of them, right? And it was a 3-year gap between this past postseason run and the one before that. How much of that is Damian Lillard's fault? No, it's not his fault that Portland just kind of fell off a cliff and they had to kind of rebuild on the fly. But yeah, that's the interesting part, is I think there's a lot of comps in the numbers. The big difference, obviously, being that James Harden won an MVP, but you have those numbers comps that would make sense. And the rest of it is, Dame hadn't gotten to the postseason as much as James. Again, team success, players partially responsible for that. I just have a hard time in making that the end all be all. But James Harden has that reputation of coming up short in those biggest moments, hiding from the moment in some cases. Yeah. And Dame, well, albeit limited, has come up big in those spots. So again, it's whenever we get into this legacy conversation, it's always like a choose your own adventure book that we're opening up. But it was just interesting to hear some of that starting to bubble up from the outside, because we're going to hear a lot more of that as we get close to the start of the season, that it's going to be, you name it, team to watch and team that has the most to gain and yada, 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 team under the most pressure. The Bucks are going to be number 1 in all of those lists, late summer, early fall. So just get yourself ready for it, prepare for that. And we already started to hear some of it on that Sunday night pod from Bill Simmons. I mentioned some more names have been added to the list of college prospects that the Bucks have worked out for the upcoming NBA draft. We're just over a week away from the draft already here. So we'll get into the updates, some of the names that stood out to us coming up after the break here on Locked On Bucks. Prize Picks is America's #1 fantasy sports app with more than 5 million members. It is the most fun and exciting way to get in on the action while you watch your favorite sports and players. You pick more than or less than on 2 or more player stats for a shot to win up to 100 times your cash. You could turn $10 into $1,000 in a single game watching your favorite sports this summer. Make a Prize Picks lineup in as little as 60 seconds. You just need to pick more or less on 2 to 6 player stat projections, and from there, you are locked in. If you're looking for promotions, Prize Picks has got you covered every week, from lowering select player stats projections on Tuesdays, which increases your chance at getting a win, to getting your entry fees back if you post a losing lineup on Fridays. All you have to do is download the app and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Again, use the code LOCKEDONNBA and get that first deposit match up to $100. Prize Picks, pick more, pick less. It's that easy. All right, Camille, the list continues to grow here that the Bucks and players that the Bucks have worked out getting set for the NBA draft. The last update I saw was, I believe, as of Saturday, and there were some interesting names that were added to that list. You and I have already talked about my guy Kashad Johnson out of Arizona, Trenton Flowers we touched on earlier, some of the other names that had popped up early in this process. Mark Sears was a player that the Bucks had worked out. I do believe he's withdrawn from the draft, but we've seen some local names, and we heard right as we were first starting to take our first look at these names, we heard, I heard Iguodaro is going to be working out for the Bucks. That has since been confirmed. The big man from Marquette. And Tristan Newton we talked about last time as well, the point guard and former teammate of Andre Jackson at UConn. But we continue to see some interesting names populate this thing here, including Zach Edey of the Purdue Boilermakers.
Now, we are going to be doing deeper dives into some of these guys, as you mentioned in upcoming episodes. But Zach Edey is one for me where I just don't know about that one. Just not completely sold on him. I love the fact that he's a 7-foot, super hard to stop scorer on the inside. Like he has some nice touch, but he is slow as well. And I think of all the Bucks fans talking about Brook Lopez and his foot speed and just how he's able to get around. And Zach Edey is not going to be too much quicker, although he's a bit younger. He's not a great outside shooter as well. He's more just on the inside there. I know I saw him talking about during the draft process of putting in the effort and working on that 3-point shot because he understands how the game is evolving, but it just isn't something that we saw in college so far. So seeing Edey come in was like, that's interesting. I would have thought that Ware would be a name that would have come in at some point, just thinking about the type of big that I've been thinking about the Bucks might need. So seeing Zach Edey on the list was interesting to me, but I was pretty excited to see that Ryan Dunn got called for an interview, a workout for the Bucks since we last talked as well.
Yeah. Zach Edey, I mean, it's, I don't want to be too dismissive. It just seems like a gimmick. You mentioned the foot speed and everything else. I mean, it's not to totally take away from what he's done. But it is much more effective to have that size, even if the athleticism and speed isn't there at the collegiate level. It's interesting. The most recent mock draft that I've seen from NBADraft.net. So basically, Zach Edey is not reaching 23 in this one or any other mock draft that I've seen, but he's in the neighborhood. So in this most recent one from NBADraft.net, they have Zach Edey going 21 to the Pelicans, who we know are going to need a center with the news around Jonas Valanciunas. At number 22, which belongs to the Phoenix Suns, they have Tyler Kolek going there, and they do have the Bucks getting Ware with the 23rd pick in this draft. So I think, and as you mentioned, we're going to get deep into the draft in the coming days here, and especially all of next week, previewing guys that are projected to be there at 23 for the Bucks and even 33 in the second round, and fallout from the draft late in the week. But I just think, as we kind of talked about, what do you do with the pick? I do wonder if there isn't necessarily a hard, fast, we're doing this. We can save money by doing this. We can use this in a package with another player, and we can potentially get under the second apron. We're moving it. I do wonder if it's we're leaning towards this, but if somebody like that drops to 23, where we could potentially start to envision life after Brooke Lopez if you
Yeah.
get aware and look at what happened last year for some teams or the last couple of years where maybe it's not the immediate impact, but you see some of that boost. What do you think about Walker Kessler specifically for the Utah Jazz and some other bigs that we've seen that it takes some time, but I do wonder if that's the thought process.
Yeah, and Walker Kessler is another one coming out of the draft where I was unsure. I was like, I'm not exactly sure what you're going to get from him. He had a pretty decent rookie year with the Jazz as well, coming out of there. But I think that's the best way to go about it. If you're the Bucks, you keep your options open. You do your due diligence when it comes to the draft process. You bring guys in, you see who could be a fit. You never know, you might fall in love with the guy and you're like, okay, we actually do want to try to make sure that we have a pick in order to acquire this particular player based on where we think he's going to go in the draft. But you also don't want to say, like, that's all we're going to do. If there's a chance to make a trade where that pick comes into play to, get you some instant help. Because the reality of the situation with the Bucks is that once Giannis turns 30 in December, all of the four main guys on this team will all be at least 30 years old. We've talked about the level of urgency with this team for a few different reasons. And now looking at the age, we know the Bucks have been one of the older rosters in the league. We understand what that means. You have Doc Rivers, you're chasing a championship. So you got to do what you have to do this year in order to try to make a stake and be ready and able to compete for a championship this season. Of course, you want to think about long-term and development and what the Bucks might look like in a few more years, but you have Giannis. And you're chasing championships. So you have to do things that are going to make your championship chase as strong as possible. That could be adding through the draft. That could be packaging that pickup and getting some more veteran-led help. We'll have to see, but you got to keep those options open. But speaking of due diligence, we're going to do that here. Like you mentioned, we're going to talk about some of the draft picks or draftees that the Bucks have been bringing in. We're going to talk about some of our draft crushes probably next week leading into the draft as well. So a lot more to discuss, but I am going to be really curious to see if when we're on here, doing Locked On Bucks post-draft, if we're saying, I can't believe the Bucks traded this draft pick, or if we're like, they actually selected so-and-so this night. Like, we'll see how it goes.
And Trace Jackson Davis is another name we should mention apropos too, as he was an Indiana kid as well, but he was, Walker Kessler, you saw it somewhat immediately. His rookie season with the Jazz. Trace Jackson Davis, same story. It was really in February is where he really started to come on for that team and show them the flashes. Basically everything that the Bucks are looking for here this offseason of, man, it'd be great to have a young athletic big that we think can do some things defensively, especially when you go back to that second game the Bucks had against the Warriors and how Trace Jackson Davis was able to play against Giannis. But I think you point to what he did, mentioned coming on in February, but especially after the All-Star break in March and April, especially, he looked very, very good for the Warriors. So if that's similar type of output that you could get with Ware, if he does fall to you in this draft, I think the Bucks would be over the moon in that instance. But as Camille mentioned, we will get into the draft process quite a bit for the remainder of this week and basically all of next week, because the draft will be Wednesday and Thursday. First time we get a 2-night draft in the NBA here. So we'll have the fallout from round 1 on Thursday's episode of Locked On Bucks and fallout from round 2 and any other moves that we saw made around the Bucks or from the Bucks on Friday's episode next week. But for the remainder of this week, obviously we'll tackle the stories that come up, the news that comes up as it does. We're going to start to get into those names that we mentioned, whether it's Ware, Zach Edey, you name it, guys the Bucks have worked out. We're going to start to take a closer look at those names, who would make the most sense to fill in there for the Bucks, who has the best chance of sliding to the Bucks. We'll start to do our examination of those draft profiles starting on this week's string of shows. So you got that to look forward to and the draft coming up next week. For Camille, I'm Justin. We'll talk to you once again tomorrow on Locked On Bucks.